Show, taking your business from seed to sapling to towering giant, with your hosts, best-selling author and business growth experts Noah Fleming and Shawn Veltman. This is the only show that gives you proven, pragmatic, and immediately applicable business growth strategies every week in 15 minutes or less. Here's Noah and Shawn.
And we're back with another fun episode of the Evergreen Show. Shawn, my co-host, Shawn Veltman, you're here, I think. Are you there?
I'm here. Can't wait.
Well, I have to ask you my signature question. How are you today? What's the weather? Where are you? Give me the scoop.
I am doing wonderfully. I'm in lovely Calgary, Alberta, Canada. The mountains are big. The sky is clear. And I think there might be some camping coming up.
Well, that's good. But if you're going camping, Shawn, there's something I need to tell you. You need to be very careful that you don't get run over by a camper. And it ties in directly to what we're going to talk about today, which is what to do when your top sales guy gets run over by a bus or a camper. What to do when one of your top people gets run over. And, you know, we're being a little bit silly here, but let's suppose you lose one of your top people. Do you have the right information from that person in place to continue? Do your sales, let me put this another way. Do your salespeople hold the keys to customer information in their own little black books? Does your company know what your top guy is doing in any area of the business? And if he leaves, are you able to continue doing what they're doing? Or are you in a position where that person is such, you know, we talked before about your people aren't your most valuable asset. Now I'm going to go back on the other side of this. But if that person has such a valuable process, which makes them a valuable asset, is your business going to survive if they get run over by a camper? What do we do, Shawn?
You know, Noah, it's a good question. It's a question that I think a lot of companies struggle with. You know, for a lot of years, and in many places, it's still the top idea is we need to hire the absolute best superstar talent we can and then just let them go and be geniuses. And I'll tell you, there are companies, and they're the high-profile companies, where this is absolutely the right approach. Right? You get your Facebooks, your Googles, your world-changing tech companies. By all means, hire the absolute best and brightest. But with no disparagement to a lot of the companies we work with, you know, they're not selling things that are changing the world. They're not creating new parts for manned space flight. And you know, the reality of it is that in many cases, what they're doing is more of a craft than an art or a science. And the distinction there is, and I'm sorry to keep going here, is that in a craft, there is a logical set of steps that you can take and get repeatable results. And, you know, for 95% of the clients we work with, that's the case in the way that their sales efforts work. It's a craft, not an art or science.
So, this reminds me of a story which I've written about in other places, but I'll share here. I was working with a company with two sales guys who were just dominating it. They were just crushing. And the CEO would say things like, you know, we just need two more of them, because these other 12 guys, they're not really doing that well. So what can we just need 12 more guys like they were Jim and Steve. We just need 12 more Jim and Steves to bring them on board and then get rid of these other guys. But the reality into what I'm saying here before your person gets hit by a bus is those Jims and Steves, they have processes, they have tools, they have techniques, they have abilities that if we can identify them, and we do this with internal benchmarking and other things we do with our clients, but if we can identify those, then typically we should be able to use that as a baseline, and more importantly, we can use that to bring other people up to the same level. So I guess, you know, it's something to think about this week of, do you have people in places in your business that if they were to get run over by Shawn's camper, you're going to be able to survive and thrive without them? Or do they hold the keys to something that you need to take further?
You know, it's interesting to me. No, this is another one of those topics that we talked a little bit about on LinkedIn, and it got even more comments and disagreements, and really, people on both sides of the argument, people who really strongly agreed with what we were saying, and people who were trying to tell us that, we're absolutely wrong on this point. And I love seeing it all, because the truth is, a lot of this is, it comes from our experience, our worldview, our experience with our clients. We're giving the best information that we have available to us, but you and I are both open to other points of view. I think what gets frustrating sometimes is that people will read a headline, or they'll read the first line of something and then immediately disagree. And, that's certainly not helpful for anybody. So, on this idea of process, we're claiming here, and this goes hand in hand with last week's podcast, that your people aren't your most valuable asset. This idea of process really comes down to, how much do you understand about what makes you successful? How much can you replicate that? How much can you teach it? One of the things that we both do quite a bit of when we're working with clients is to find distinctions, right? What separates you from your competitors? What separates you from the people who are doing better than you or worse than you as a company, as an individual? And identifying those distinctions ends up becoming extremely useful in figuring out what the best next course of action is. And ultimately, I think that's what we mean when we talk about process, is identifying the distinctions that make your top people, and trying to bring those out to everybody else in the organization, not even necessarily to replicate them. There may be intangibles they have that you will never replicate. But if they're following a 6-step process and everybody else is doing a 3-step process, adding in those extra 3 steps for everybody else will certainly have a huge uptick in their respective capabilities.
So let me comment on 2 things there. One was sort of the off-topic comment about, posting on LinkedIn and people getting all fired up and excited and angry and in agreement or disagreement. And I think there's an important line that my mentor, Dr. Alan Weiss, says, which is, if you're not being defriended, delisted, defrocked, decomposed on a daily basis by people on the internet, then you're not doing something enough. So ramp up your branding, ramp up your marketing. You want to get to a point where not everybody loves you, but some people really hate you, because that's when you're doing it right. But the next point you made there is important to what happened with Jim and Steve. And it was that Jim and Steve actually had their own process that they had developed over the years that they were using, where the other 10 or 12 sales guys weren't doing much of anything, because there was no company sales process as a whole that everybody could use. So when we looked at Jim and Steve, what we found was they were doing things on their own, but they were pretty similar. And so we could work with them, and we worked with the sales manager to start to build a codified, unique, sales process for this company. And then very quickly, as we start to implement this and get the other guys on board, we start to see the results go up. We start to see the results change. So some of the specifics that they were engaged in, were like, they were doing research on the client before making a visit or before making a prospecting call. They were each running their own little CRM tool in Excel, right? Now, the crazy thing is, this is a $300+ million company that was doing this, but they always had a next contact date for clients. And so these guys had this process, and it just took a little outside, some outside eyes to come in and look and go, okay, what are they doing here? And then how can we borrow some of this? And how can we make this useful to others? And that's exactly what we did.
One of the things that I love doing and I love seeing is when we go into companies, sometimes it's exactly like Jim and Steve here, where they were doing substantially similar things. Other times, what I'm fascinated by is when we find high performers who are doing very different things, different from each other, and certainly different from the low performers. And what always amazes me is that the most fight comes from the low performers to try to adopt the habits and the tactics of the high performers, whereas the high performers will try out the things that the other high performers are doing and see if it works for them. It's an amazing shift, and we'll talk more about differences in attitude and differences in uptake and all the rest of that later on. But I'm just amazed that, you can have we're not saying there's only one way to be successful. There's many ways to the top of the mountain. What's really amazing is when you find two people who've got to the top from very different paths, and then they share those and become even more successful than either was on their own.
Yeah, so I think the two things you mentioned there, one is definitely another podcast, or perhaps many hundreds of podcasts where we could talk about those people and do it as nicely as possible. But you're absolutely right. When we do, for example, internal benchmarking with clients, let's say in a retail establishment with multiple locations, it allows us to find out things like where are the outliers, and then we can review and say, are they doing something differently? And then we can start to set a baseline. So you talked about the two guys climbing up the mountain, right? And then they share notes. It's exactly the same thing. And then this allows us to create these formal structures. And again, I say formal in quotes because nothing is that rigid, which you've heard us talk about before, right? But creating formal structures and processes around the most important things you do makes it a lot easier to replicate, to train others, to pass on to others that aren't doing as well, and to help them grow. And I think that to me is the gist of exactly what we're saying here and why it's so important.
And it's interesting. I've talked a little bit in a previous podcast about the fact that I've been teaching various martial arts for the past 20 years or so. For most of that time, it's been Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and mixed martial arts. And one of the things that's amazing to me, both in those sports, but generally in sports, is that it's not always the highest performers who are the best coaches or teachers. They're two very different skill sets. Just being able to do something doesn't mean that you're able to communicate what you're doing or help others to get better at it. There's, often top performers put a lot of time into tweaking the way that they become successful. And it's just assumed by many people that they're going to be able to share that, to communicate it. And that's often not the case. So I think in a lot of companies, we find people will say, I don't know how I do that. I just do it. Or I just do what feels right. And it works for me. But when we watch them, when we take the time to look for the distinctions, to see the patterns in what they're doing, almost always we find, what will later become a system or a process. And it's that ability to step back from what you're actually doing and to notice the patterns and to codify what's happening into the logical set of steps that is incredibly important, not just for being able to communicate, but for being able to train others, for being able to measure success, for being able to take a low performer and say, look, here's what our top performers are doing, so try these things. Let's see if they work for you. And if you don't have that process in place, if you haven't codified it, then what can you really do to help coach a low performer? You can't say, be more like Jim. That's bad coaching.
Well, we've seen a lot of bad coaching, but
yeah, it's like saying, get self-confidence, stupid.
yeah, cheer up. Come on, look in the mirror and say you're a good, fun, happy person. What was the old Saturday Night Live?
I'm good enough, That's smart enough, and doggone it, people like me.
That's right. Now go walk over some hot coals.
Yeah, and you're done.
Okay, so let's wrap this up. Challenge for this week. Your challenge for this week. Okay, it's a pretty interesting way where we help you do this. We're going to ask you to find one thing that you actually do really well. One thing you're actually really good at in your company, in your organization. But then ask yourself, can you really explain this to somebody new? Do you have a process for the way that you do this well? And if you don't, that's a trouble spot. So instead of trying to find areas where, maybe we can improve here, let's see if there's a process, ask yourself this first. What is one thing we do really well, but we can explain to somebody new, that we don't have a written out, formalized in quotes, but a formalized process for? And then take an hour and see if you can identify what you're doing in that area that makes you successful. Now ask yourself, can you codify this? Can you codify this? And then test it out. Take that process to somebody who isn't perhaps doing as well in that area, or somebody new, and ask them to follow through and see if you can instantly bring them up to that level. And I think what you'll find is you'll be really pleasantly surprised. This is extremely effective coaching and training material that you can use in almost any area of your business. So Shawn, anything else you want to add to my issued challenge there for our listeners today?
I think that's a great challenge. I don't have anything to add to that. I hope that our listeners will take you up on it and let us know what they find, whether it's successful or not for them.
So, as always, thank you for tuning in. Listen, a great way to get in touch with Shawn or I is you can email me off my website, noahfleming.com. Shawn and I are co-authors on a book. We also do multiple projects together. We talk pretty much daily, so it's a great way to get in touch with us. Let us know what you're thinking about this. But as always, thank you for listening. Please leave us a review. It's very helpful. And of course, share this with others. And the last thing I want to say here is, look, if you take these challenges seriously, that simple process we just gave you can change your business in so many ways. And it's so simple and so effective. So give it a try. If you need a little bit more info, get in touch with us. But otherwise, we will see you next week.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to join us each and every week for another great episode of The Evergreen Show with your hosts, Noah Fleming and Shawn Veltman. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review, and we'll catch you next time on The Evergreen Show.